Julie, you've been working with Enterprise Ireland and I think with the IDA also for some 30 years, but you started up growing in the middle of a very, very big family. And when I say a big family, that's an understatement, isn't it?
That's an understatement. I'm one of 13.
13?
Yeah. So I have 9 sisters and 3 brothers. So I grew up in a small business, keeping all of that going. I was the 7th daughter, and I have 3 brothers and 3 sisters younger. So it was a busy house. We had a business. We were in the poultry business, and then we went into having a petrol station and shop and reno agency. So, and we all had rotas on every wall that was empty in the house for cooking, dishes, petrol, attendants, etc. So
you got a taste for how to grow and run a small business at a very early stage.
Yeah, it was part of, we all were involved in it, and we all grew up, and it was part of life. As was, and when I look back, my mother's family were all in business as well, as were my father's family, but my mother's mother was the matriarch who ran the place. So it was something that on both families we had always a lot of involvement in the business.
And Terence, you had a slightly different route. I mean, you had spent 40 years, I think, in KPMG, starting out, I think, in the early 70s, and then rising to become the managing partner in KPMG Ireland in 2006, before you left in 2013, which is around the same time that you became the chairperson of Enterprise Ireland. So in those 4 decades, I mean, other than great suits and nice lunches, what did you learn about business and the mechanics of running a big company in that time?
Well, I should go back to where Julie started as well, because I grew up in County Monaghan and my father ran a small animal feed mill. So I grew up in a business helping with customers, helping load lorries, deliver pig meat and chicken meat around the farmers of South Monaghan. So I saw that at an early age. I then did history and economics in UCD, and that doesn't equip you for anything. So, and then
Still doesn't, by the way, but anyway.
No, but I enjoyed it. It was great, and that idea. Then I went on to chartered accountancy, and I said I'd take a few years out in KPMG to see what that was like, to get my qualification and see the world. And then I never saw anything better that I enjoyed more, so I really enjoyed that. So with that business background, I was able then, even though I had my college degree wasn't particularly business oriented, I was still able to understand what I saw in the audits. And auditing, as an auditor I was, you get in to see the nuts and bolts of all sorts of businesses, all sizes of businesses. And I loved my funeral undertaker or my clothes manufacturer or my furniture maker that I audited in the 70s, but I also audited banks and public companies and semi-state bodies as well.
You kind of know where a lot of bodies are buried, I have to put it to you.
Yeah, the funeral undertakers, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Now, Julie, you were appointed Chief Executive of Enterprise Ireland in 2013, which was the same year that you were appointed chairman of the organisation. You hadn't really known each other, had you, before that?
I think the first time, well, I might have been at one dinner that Terence was, and I was introduced to him, but my first encounter with him was when he interviewed me for the job. Mm-hmm. So I must have done okay, but that was the first.
That's right. My first, I was asked by Richard Bruton to become chairman, and the first thing I had to do was to join an interview panel, which interviewed the final list of candidates for the EI CEO.
Yeah.
So it was the first time I crossed around.
I have to ask at the outset, for people in the room or who might be listening to this podcast will go out on Friday, there will be some who will ask, why do you need a separate board or chairperson and a chief executive, especially in an organisation like Enterprise Ireland? How do you both see that? How do you both answer that question? Why do we need a chief executive and a chairperson?
Well, Enterprise Ireland, first of all, it's not a limited company, so it does not governed by company law, which requires a board and all the rest. It's a statutory corporation. The government set it up and said, go off and do these things. But while the government has policies and all the rest, I think the role of the board is very clear to make sure that the strategy is developed in accordance with the government policies and then is implemented. So our job is regularly, which the department can't do on a day-to-day or a month-to-month basis, see what the executives are doing, hear about their plans, and then challenge them and then encourage them and support them to get those executed.
Okay, now you used the word challenge there, and I know you said that you were just going to nod and agree with everything Julie said, but I mean, in those 6 years, for example, has there ever been a time when you have had to challenge the executive leadership?
Yeah, probably not something I do myself. It's more that the board would debate something And you'd see, as we discuss something further, and we've got great boards, great members of the boards, very diverse and broad set of skills. And you'll see times coming that the managers want to do something and the board will be saying, no, I'm not sure that's the right thing to do, steer it over here. Not massive 360-degree turns, but certainly change direction from northwest to northeast or something like that.
Now, I'm a journalist, so I'm now going to ask you, give me an example of that. Give me an example of when that might have happened.
Well, some of this is like, did we do it or the management going to do it anyway? One example was we were doing our strategy for 2016 to 2020. We've been working on it for months, and we were about to sign off it in June 2016, when suddenly there was a referendum across the water. And then we decide, what are we going to do now? Are we going to just say, forget that referendum, we don't know what's going to happen, it could be some years before that, let's keep our strategy in place, or do we immediately recalibrate our strategy? So the board decided, no, we're going to recalibrate the strategy. Let's stop our strategy work, stand back, take a couple of months to reflect on what Brexit's going to mean for us, and we said to management, go back again, do your homework, and let's come back to us with taking the Brexit decision into account, as an example.
And how did that process and that decision sit with you at the time, Julie?
Well, I mean, I think it was clear that we had developed with the strategy ready to go to the July board. 23rd of June came. It was literally ready for circulation, and it was such a massive change in direction and such implications for the companies that I don't think it's one that there would have been a lot of disagreement. I mean, obviously you've spent probably 9 months working on a strategy and you literally had to tear it up and start again, and we did. So I think there was general consensus that that was really necessary. But I think just going back to the board versus the executive, I think what has probably evolved over the last 5 or 6 years is much more co-creation of the strategic inputs from the start.
What does co-creation
mean? It means that, for example, there's a strategy and policy subcommittee of the board. So the executive would engage with the board throughout the process, because no point in going at the end of the journey and saying, here's the strategy for life sciences, when you have 2 or 3 board members who have grown and started companies in that space and would have very clear views as to what's possible and what isn't possible. So rather than come in with a fait accompli, we would work closely with the board on the policy development issues in order to get their inputs throughout the process.
So on that Brexit referendum pivot, for example, how did that materially affect? What did you go back and change in your plan? And in your answer, you might also give us an idea of the scale and depth and breadth of what Enterprise Ireland does.
Well, if you take, I mean, the UK is our #1 export market. And prior to that strategy, the whole focus of the strategy that we binned was all about growth as opposed to sustaining. So the strategy turned out to have 2 different specific areas of it. One is about continuing to grow Irish industry, because there's lots of companies that are quite immune from Brexit. And the other part was to identify the vulnerable companies and to work very specifically on sustaining them. So it was increasing the focus on competitiveness issues, helping companies through lean, more focus on innovation, because if you're going to go into new markets, the products that you're selling into the UK mightn't work for mainland Europe or Asia. And then diversification. The objective is to grow exports outside the UK by 50% by 2020. None of that, intense focus. In many ways, it intensified the focus of some of the areas that we might have done anyway, but it was much sharper. We have 34 offices around the world. We're in the process of opening another 7, and we have 700 plus staff between the overseas side and in Ireland. And then we're investing each year in somewhere between 180 and 200 new startup companies. So it's
in Ireland.
In Ireland.
And typically, how much would that investment represent?
Typically, we're investing 30 million a year in those startup companies, and that either is through the Competitive Start Fund, which is really a large feasibility fund, and about 100 of those are in the 250 to 300,000 is typically the scale of investment. And increasingly, for some of the sectors like life sciences that need larger sums of money, we will write potentially bigger checks at the start.
We see a lot of evidence in a lot of big tech companies that I cover, and founders and chief executives that I often interview. A lot of those type of companies now want to embody their chief executive and their chairperson in one person. So Mark Zuckerberg in Facebook, for example, is the founder, the chairman, and also the chief executive. Is that a good idea, taking into account what you said earlier about the difference between enterprise and Ireland? Does that present a problem, do you think, for a big company or a big enterprise? And you might again explain why it is that the structure of the board is really important.
Well, I reflect on the fact that as managing partner of KPMG, I had no chairman. There was a single, person at the top of the pyramid. And that worked for us as a partnership, which is a different kind of operating body. But I do think that the separation of chairman and CEO, that there is benefit of having both people involved, because the CEO is definitely involved in execution, operations, development of strategy, and all that stuff. And then the chairman is somebody who's kind of separate, non-executive, so not inside the company, and then can kind of come in and stand over and ask questions which the CEO doesn't get. I mean, in my previous role in KPMG, if there were difficult issues, there was nobody else. Nobody else to talk to. So at least we have each other to talk to. So when Julie comes across a difficult issue that she's pondering with, it's not something a very sensitive matter. It could be a personnel matter, not something she can maybe talk through with her top team. She can always come to me.
But might you have also resented oversight of somebody else, second-guessing decisions that you were making as the managing partner?
That's when personalities are important,
Yeah.
because it depends on the working relationship. So you need to have somebody who's going to be there, but not looking over your shoulder all the time. So
that's the reason that Steve Jobs left Apple, for example, because he had a board that was persuaded by a former Pepsi chief executive that he was doing the wrong thing, and they kicked him out.
Yeah.
And that was disastrous for Apple.
Yeah.
On the other hand, we've seen many instances where boards have not checked the power of chief executives properly, and that has also been disastrous.
Well, it's the UK corporate governance model versus the US one. The US one is single person, but I think they're beginning to change a little bit more now. Obviously, the UK and the continental model is separate CEO and chairman, and that works, I think.
Yeah. I think that independence between the two, and as long as there's clarity on what the role of the chairman, if you have both, as opposed to the chief executive. I mean, to me, while I'm on the board, and the board has a big role in development of the strategy and setting the direction for the organisation, I see it as my job to deliver that strategy and deliver the results. And I think being accountable to a board is something which probably raises the challenge in terms of forcing, accountability on a CEO that they might not otherwise have.
How often, on a practical level, every year, how often do you meet or interact?
We have monthly board meetings. Always sit down with Julie in advance of the board meetings, go through the agenda. If we're going to change the agenda, shape it, whatever it is, that we have good discussion on what issues that need to be dealt with. And then typically Enterprise Ireland are running events almost every day. I mean, if I wanted to be involved in Enterprise Ireland, I could spend my life going to Enterprise Ireland events, but I don't. And Julie's very kind and saying she asked, with these 3 things would you please go to. But typically there's 1 or 2 things in a month that we would see each other at anyway. So that's the kind of rhythm. When Frank Bryan, who was the chief executive at the time, I actually started as chairman, I said, Frank, how long will this take, this time commitment to chairman? He said, about 2 or 3 days a month. And to be fair, that's what's been about 2 or 3 days a month, which is not incredibly onerous, but it works on that basis.
And what other elements would you identify as being important between the chairperson and a chief executive? I mean, personalities is clearly important. You're both clear, the room can see you're both clearly very agreeable people. You clearly get on, That's a very good thing, but it may not always be the case, right?
Yeah. I think, first of all, there has to be respect and trust in each other, which would probably mean that if I say I'm going to do something, I hope that Terence believes that I will do it, and therefore he's not sitting, micromanaging. And I think in some cases where there is, where there's maybe delivery problems, that probably intensifies issues. I think the personality, they have to be that they have to be compatible. They don't have to be necessarily the same. They can be quite different, but I think there has to be that trust and openness. I think being prepared. While I would see that I'm accountable to the board, I actually do see the chair as a sounding board, and if there are issues, you may not be able to discuss those internally with anybody else. So having that confidence that you can have that conversation and a fairly open discussion on whatever the issues are.
Enterprise Ireland is one of those organisations that we write about and we read about, and it has massive geographical breadth. It's relied upon by a lot of small businesses and organisations in every single county of Ireland. And I've often wondered, does that bring with it a political dimension? Because it's essentially a semi-state body. Do either of you end up being lobbied by politicians, ministers, other political figures? This county, we've been ignored. How much does that actually come out in the day-to-day?
Well, first of all, I have a minister from Monaghan and a chairman from Monaghan. So
there's an Ulster cabal here going on.
What I would say is, obviously there are public representatives who are very keen to put forward issues for their constituency, and I think that's the reality. That's different from lobbying. I think that's something which I would see as making sure, and there's some particular regions in Ireland that are really black spots from an employment perspective, and that we would certainly have engagement with politicians on both, on all sides of the political divide in terms of, understanding the issues and actually working with the local communities in many cases. We now have regional action plans, and I think they've been really good at getting all of the local communities to work together in terms of setting out what the Midlands or the North East or the North West can be good at, and then funding them in on a competitive basis to be able to support those initiatives.
Where is the balance there between wanting to maximise the return for the organisation and therefore the state versus being an instrument of, helping unemployment black spots or maybe social and infrastructural issues? Where is the balance there? There must be a balance that you've got to, a fine line you've got to tread there sometimes.
Well, we're a development agency. That's our key objective. We also have the largest investment portfolio in terms of numbers of investments of any investor in Ireland. So we would have almost 3,000 equity investments in companies. Sometimes there's a challenge between an equity decision and a development decision, and in those cases we are a development agency. But we're also there to make decisions where there is a business that can grow. So it is not, just putting funding in for the sake of putting funding in. And that's why having structures in place, be it investment committees, boards, research and development committees, that are making decisions on whether or not this proposition can actually be implemented. So it's important that we are going through due process on that.
There's a fair amount of expectation out there in the system, that you will deliver and look after everything. But one of the great things I've found about Enterprise Ireland when I came in from the outside of the private sector was that the governance standards were fantastic. In terms of conflicts of interest, regularly anybody who's any suspicion of that anybody think that you shouldn't be in the room, the people who are not in the room, they don't get the papers for the particular item, they don't even know what we're discussing, they just know that they're excluded from it as board members. And we are one of the few state bodies which has an ISO. We every year make sure the ISO standard on corporate governance, we get certified in that every year. So we are handling public money, taxpayers' money, so we've got to be absolutely straight down the line and making sure that everything we do is properly done. And to be fair to the politicians or the local representatives or people saying, why did you look after my area, put more support in there, they know they'll get a good hearing and they know that our processes are robust and strong. So whenever we get people complaining afterwards, you shafted me, you did anything wrong, because I'm pretty sure that our processes are robust. Touch wood.
Okay, I'm going to move on to a couple of topical issues because this week we've just seen or we're about to see, maybe as we talk even, a new British Prime Minister sworn in by the Queen. We have the referendum you were talking about, Brexit. Can I ask you first for an overview, first about Brexit? What are the particular challenges that creates for small businesses in Ireland? and also how that might affect, if any, your relationship between the chair and the chief executive?
Well, first of all, from the point of view of business, the UK is our number one market. It's not as important as it was 10 years ago in overall terms. So if we go back 10 years ago, 44% of our exports went into the UK. Today, it's 33%. We've grown the UK exports by over 50% in that time, but we've grown the rest of the world at a faster rate.
Where are they going now predominantly? Where is the stock taking?
The US is a good market. Eurozone is our number 2 market if you take the whole Eurozone countries as one lump. So last year, the UK grew by 4%, the Eurozone grew by 8%. And that is a very specific policy in terms of working within Enterprise Ireland and with the Minister in terms of a very active engagement on trade missions with a view to encouraging companies to look outside the UK. So obviously in some sectors, so that sounds good, say it was 44 and now it's 33. Actually for some sectors it's 70, 80, 90%, so it still is, it's very challenging. Particularly food is our largest sector, it's 55% of exports from Irish companies, and the UK is about 40% of food exports, so that is particularly challenging depending on where we end up on the negotiations for a hard Brexit. And at times people say, well, let's just get on with it. This has dragged on long enough. If you're selling cheddar cheese into the UK, the WTO tariffs under products like that would be enormous and very damaging.
I know 2 separate startups, one in the food industry and one in the software industry, who actually moved their office from Ireland to the UK because they're small businesses with modest growth expectations, because that is their biggest market, and now they have to try and plan for a standalone UK, and so they actually moved their office there.
Yeah. So the tariffs, depending on where you end up, would make some products into the UK extremely challenging. Delays at ports would be something which, so having the whole logistics operations in place to be able to guard for that. A lot of the UK customers had told Irish clients, you're holding 2 weeks stock, you're going to have to hold 3 weeks stock, or whatever, depending on the product, to allow for any delays in shipping. Importing product can also be a cause for problems if it's coming in from the UK in terms of the impact of that arriving in Ireland. And we've gone through and looked at logistics. What we've found though, on a positive note, a lot of Irish companies were sourcing in the UK, but the actual products were coming from Europe. So they're coming from Europe into the UK, taking an exchange rate hit from the sterling back into euro, plus all the costs. And as a result of Brexit, companies have actually started going directly to the European supplier and bypassed the UK. So there's been a lot of cost taken out of the system by companies in order to do it. Obviously, the freedom of movement is something which we believe will still be the case. So that's not an issue. But it's the cost, and if you're producing cheddar cheese for the UK, and go into Europe, they don't eat a lot of cheddar cheese. So you suddenly have to produce something else other than cheddar, and that means product development as well as market development, and that's money. And the impact in the short term has been, the exchange rate has taken a significant amount of the profitability out of companies going into the UK, so they've less money for innovation. So there's quite, Brexit is impacting today. It isn't something that will happen after Boris Johnson and Europe decide what the final deal is. It's actually impacting today on a lot of sectors.
And in terms of the board agenda, Brexit is just going to be the first item, and if we don't get to it soon enough, the board get very antsy, because it is such an unknown, such a potentially huge impact on Irish companies. And we feel as an agency, our job is to make sure we're on top of it as best we can. Now, the team has been responding fantastically, but the board have been quite challenging in that area. Have you done this? Have you done this? Have you done this? And some of these things it's not possible to do everything for, but we think we're, as best placed as we can be.
And whatever about getting forgiveness, had we had a decision in March with a 6-month extension and we're not ready to go. So we have to, as an organisation, be making plans on the basis that there will be a hard Brexit at the end of October.
Terence, will Boris make it worse or better?
I have no idea. That's a political question, ecumenical matter.
Well, you're a man with experience. You've been around all the big companies. You know how the world works.
All I can say is that myself and Julie were privileged to be with Michael D. Higgins when he visited London, the first state visit an Irish president in London in 2014. She took me as our +1, which I was delighted.
My husband still hasn't forgiven me, by the way.
Going to Windsor, meeting the Queen in the Guildhall and the rest. It was fantastic, but it was also a fantastic opportunity for Irish businesses. And you can see then the relationship between UK and Ireland was fantastic. And I worry now about the quality of our relationship between the UK and Ireland. And I don't think it's going to improve with Mr. Johnson. I don't know, but he's very amiable, but he's not acting in our best interests. It's based on what his policies have been so far.
Yeah, do you not think he'll go out of his way in the first few months to try and be Mr. Nice Guy, and he'll go to Belfast?
He'd be very amiable, very agreeable, to use your word from earlier. He'd be good. But the policies he stated would be disastrous for us. If the do or die policy would be just disastrous for us.
Yeah. I mean, maybe that was just campaigning guff.
Maybe, I hope it was just campaigning, yes.
Yeah. Can I ask you about another intellectual world leader, Donald Trump, in the US? Under his leadership, the US government has started to take a more protectionist approach on trade issues. Has that affected things for us from an Enterprise Ireland perspective?
Well, you've been in Washington the last years.
Yeah. Well, first of all, in terms of the story we tell in Washington is much different than it was prior to President Trump coming in. I mean, what most people don't realise, there's 100,000 people employed in the US in Irish companies. There's 150,000 people employed in Ireland in US companies. Most people don't realise the contribution that Irish companies make to the US. So we would be using the opportunity of St. Patrick's Day and all of the access to politicians to make sure that people in the US recognise the contribution of Ireland to making America great again. I mean, it is a different story from that perspective. I think, you know, in terms of, I mean, the US has been a very strong export market for Irish companies, you know, over the last number of years. But I think, you know, the protectionist policies which are being implemented, and that there could be collateral damage outside of, you know, that unintended consequences and maybe intended consequences in terms of putting barriers up between countries. And that's why, more than ever, even if it wasn't for Brexit, you need a balanced portfolio of markets so that we don't have all our eggs in the one basket.
And those Irish companies, do you mean companies like CRH or Glanbia or big?
All of those. I mean, it's CRH, Glanbia, Kerry, and lots of technology companies that have put a presence into the UK.
Netwatch,
companies like
Icon.
Netwatch that have made a lot of acquisitions in the UK. Icon, yeah. So it's you know, when you look at, you know, a couple of hundred here and a couple of hundred there, it adds up considerably, and that's important that people don't see that this is all one-way traffic, and that they recognise. You know, and you know, even collecting that data is something that 3 or 4 years ago we would never have done. Why would we want to know how many people were about employment in Ireland? It has forced a much more joined up approach between IDA and Enterprise Ireland in terms of IDA being aware of the number of people in the US being employed in Irish companies and the contribution of those companies.
And I mean, my feedback from talking to the American Embassy here is that we've positioned ourselves very well. That story that Julie and her team have been telling in Washington of the strength of the Irish companies investing in the US, employing people in the US, that's gone down well in Washington. And as a country, given everybody has their own issues with Mr. Trump, but as a country we seem to be well positioned, and it's a delicate position to be in. But
does it work better in individual states? Like if you can target a state with a swing Senate vote to say, well, Irish companies employ 9,000 people in that state.
We know, we have the data by state. We know every state we go into, we can tell the story of. I'm going to speak in St. Louis in Missouri next month, and I'm going to tell the story of what the Irish companies in there are doing in Missouri. And there aren't many, but there are some, and there are some very innovative things happening with Irish investment in Missouri. So, and we have that story for every state in the US. We do talk to the state governors and the state senators and all the rest, absolutely.
And the US is very actively targeting Irish companies to get them to put a presence in the US. Mm-hmm. Now, actually, we encourage all of our clients to put a presence in the US. If you want to be taken serious in an export market, you need to commit to it. And having a presence in the UK, and for many companies, an acquisition can get you in faster. And we would be working closely with the various states and Select USA in order to help Irish companies transition into the US, and using the facilities, just like US companies coming into Ireland having access to IDA, we now would be working closely with Select USA to help our Irish companies get into the US as easily as possible.
And it's a very strong economy, so there's great opportunities for Irish companies in the US at the moment as well.
That must be a very tricky balance and exercise, because in the tech sector, for example, as soon as the young engineers arrive in Silicon Valley or New York or Boston or Raleigh or any of the big tech centers in the States, all of a sudden the economy is 10 times as big as it would be from Dublin. I mean, one of the last times that I spoke in this theatre, I was introducing a young guy called John Collison, who was a young Limerick guy who, with his brother, had started up a company that nobody had really heard of. And his presentation, instead of guffing and waffling like I did on the day, his presentation was an actual real-life software program where he coded something to make money from the internet by the end of his presentation. Now, he and his brother obviously went on to form Stripe. Stripe is now one of the fastest growing tech companies in the world. It's valued at about $23 billion. It has taken about $1 billion in funding. I think John Collison is the youngest self-made billionaire in the world now. But my question was going to be, in terms of the balance of encouraging young Irish startups to go to America, is it possible that Stripe could have been built and kept in Ireland and projected offices into the US? And would we be right in encouraging other tech entrepreneurs to go to the States in that way?
Personally, I think that it's not an either or. And I mean, Stripe have a lot of people employed in Ireland now. Yes. And they work with IDA, and they've, strong employment opportunities. And they work
with our small companies as well.
Yeah. No, but I mean, they've worked in IDA as an FDI coming back into Ireland. I think one of the things that we're very cautious about is when we get companies to put a presence into the market. And when you look at places like Israel that have very strong collaboration with the US, when I've talked to my counterparts in Israel, they'll say in many ways, if the companies go too soon, they'll just ship the whole operation into the US. So what you're ideally trying to do is have something sticky in Ireland, so that Ireland is the headquarters, and that you put a presence in the US, but Ireland is still key. And move out of technology. If you take an area like food, look at companies like Kerry and Glanbia. They have internationalized, and now Europe is winning as a result of what they've done overseas by bringing stuff. So if you take Kerry on the Naas Road, that is taking technology that they had in the States and the development that they did outside of Ireland and bringing it back and employing 1,000 people in research and technology on the Naas Road.
I mean, isn't Ireland, in the instance of Kerry, part of Kerry's actual brand? Yeah. In a way that it wouldn't be for most companies, because you think of Kerry Group, it's about pure Irish food.
Obviously food, but Kerry has a lot of business to business stuff. It is the technical solutions that they're selling, and it is less important that it being Irish.
I'm sure a lot of Kerry's customers in Asia and America don't even know it's an Irish company.
Right.
In fact, most people assume it's part of Kerrygold.
Right.
And they don't sort of uninform them, or whatever the word is.
Yeah, disabuse them of the notion.
Disabuse them is the word, yeah.
Can I talk a little bit about Enterprise Ireland's future? Where do you see it in the next few years, and what are the big challenges for the agency?
Well, I think...
I know our answer to this one, so I'll let it go.
I think firstly, I think the diversification agenda is really important.
What does that mean?
And that means continuing to grow. It isn't just about growing the level of exports, which is important, but it's about changing the global footprint. And hence, if you take it this year in opening new presences, from Seattle to Melbourne and Ho Chi Minh, it's about helping companies and open opportunities for them outside of the traditional market. So I think what we need to do is diversify more from the UK. We won't walk away from the UK. I think it will continue to be strong, but we need to have a more balanced portfolio. Innovation is something which I think is not where it needs to be in Ireland. The spend by Irish companies typically, and obviously you've got the exceptions to it. But in general, when we travel overseas with companies, the companies that succeed spend more on innovation. We can look at direct correlation, be it innovation within the companies, innovation with the third level, and the level of exports is about 67% higher.
Just to ask you to define innovation, because it's one of those words that gets thrown around so much.
So, for obviously, research and development is part of it, but it's also about the whole business processes and the business models. It's much wider than just the product.
So it could be design, it could be just the way you present yourself, it could be innovation in marketing, innovation in employment and HR. I mean, the best Irish companies are ones that are always looking at the edge. Can they do something different, do something new, capture a market, get a sustainable advantage? So those are the best companies who spend on working out how can they be more innovative.
Any come to mind off the top of your head?
Well, if you take companies, if you take in engineering, a company like CombiLift, I mean, forklift trucks.
Monaghan company.
85 countries around the world, and why people don't buy from us because we're nice people, even though we are. The bottom line is, it is because they're solving a problem, and what they developed was a forklift truck that basically can turn on a sixpence. So it really allows companies to use warehouse space much tighter because of the ability of the forklift truck to operate. That's something which is innovation, which is world leading. If you take the same into everything, if you take agri-tech, up until 15 or 20 years ago, the agri-tech companies sold on the Irish market and into the UK. Then you had a crash and they started to globalise, and what you realise, we were in New Zealand a few weeks ago at Field Days, which is the equivalent of their ploughing championships. We had 11 agri-tech companies, massively successful, really great companies, and again, it's innovation. If you go into food, we've talked about the Glambiers and the Kerrys and whoever they might be. I see Pat Higgins here, so you have a great innovator with the Quealy Group over the years in terms of what they have done. So we have great examples in every sector. It isn't just in the sexy digital areas, it's across everything. The last time we brought our board together with a group of companies, which we do every year, to talk about what direction should we be going in for the year ahead. And I was at a table with all of the beef barons. Now, there was a time when what you would be talking about at that table was grant money. We actually spent the night talking about robotics and the issues that they have with labour and what work that they're doing in terms of really trying to automate whatever can be done. And when you look at how automation is used, in heart surgery, in some places you can. There's no reason why you wouldn't be able to bone animals. I mean, there is a potential to use technology in every sector. So when we look forward, it's about how AI and digitalization, robotics, all these things will impact on all of the sectors, not just the high-tech sectors.
And I might just add one other thing, obviously very big on our agenda now is climate change and the government's climate change plan. So we spent a lot of time at the last board talking about this, and we now asked the management to go off and do a series of research and issues, come back to us. How can we contribute to this? What things should we be? I mean, there's great opportunities for Ireland in the climate change adaptation and transition. So we made to make sure we're backing the right horses in that. But also, what impact would climate change have on the people that were already employing lots of people and may not be able to do that as easily in the future? So what future proofing can we do for those companies and help nudge them on the journey? So that's a big issue for us in the years ahead, I think.
Are there any questions from the floor? Maybe somebody has a question. Oh, there's his question right here. The lady in the blue there, the front table. You might actually give your name also.
Thank you. My name is Regina from National College of Ireland. I was looking at the report there where you stated that you have backed 29 of the high potential startups by females out of 132. Now that, is a good figure. But I was looking at the stats about board level, and in Ireland you're only looking at 12% of the CEOs being female and only 7% being chairperson. Is this something that you address? Is this within your remit, or is
Absolutely.
this on your horizon?
I just start with saying our board is 42% female, and the government's target was 40, so 5 out of our 12 board members are female. And it's certainly something we have on our agenda. The board is gender, and I'll let Julie just talk about how we're implementing that.
So if we go back to the high potential startup area, up until 2011, 7% of our entrepreneurs that we were supporting were female. In fact, it wasn't even 7%, it was 7% of our companies had a female in them on the ownership.
Yeah,
one female in the ownership. So it was probably 7 out of about 250, right? Last year, the figure was 22% for the same pool. Now, this isn't just an Irish problem, it is a global problem. 8% of technology entrepreneurs globally are female. And when you look at areas like Silicon Valley, they compare equally as badly as everywhere else. I mean, it is something that, so we did a lot of work looking on what the issues were, access to funding, access to the whole networking thing. I mean, women operate differently from men. Confidence was an issue, ambition was an issue. In fact, the first time we did a female-only fund, not one female, and I can say not one, applied for the amount of money we said we were giving them. Now, I have been over 30 years in development agencies, from IDA to Ferber to Enterprise Ireland. I have never seen a man, when you say, I'm giving you X, they say, well, I only want 2/3 of X. So the good news is, when we get projects in from females now, they all go for the amount of money that we say is available for whatever the project is. But actually, role models, apparently females are more influenced by role models than males. And the fact that there are less female entrepreneurs, again, we had to put a spotlight on the successes. We've done a lot of work on that side. So we have made progress. It still is a work in progress. But if you take 2/3 of our startups in the HPSU side, HPSU being high potential startups, come from middle and senior management in existing companies. And if there are less females in middle and senior management, then you have a smaller pool to fish in, and therefore longer term you have to impact on that. So we have a day in September with the board, and one of the 3 topics for the day will be female entrepreneurship. And it is about broadening the issue and dealing right back to women in management and leadership within our companies, and you know, as to what we do. We run Leadership for Growth, for example. On a good year, we have maybe 3 women out of 30 participants. So the feedback we've got from some of the women that did it was, we organise it, sounds great, you know, 3 weeks in Stanford or 3 weeks in IMD or 3 weeks wherever it might be outside Ireland. A lot of females have said it actually doesn't suit. We're already juggling family and juggling this, and so we need to design programs for women, by women. Now, that doesn't mean that they're women-only programs. It's quite, they might suit men as well, but what we need to do is make sure that they suit women. So we are now actually broadening the agenda in a way that we haven't done previously.
And we just add to that to say, gender is obviously one issue in diversity, but there are other issues as well. There are lots of very talented new people to Ireland, and are we making sure that they're in our system as well? They understand we can support them if we want to start up companies. So we could look more at the diversity issue. Gender would probably be the number 1 part of that, but we'd be widening the funnel to see can we get it.
I mean, I'll just add, there's in the private sector, the venture capital community, it's way worse. So I took a year's funding of tech companies in Ireland from all of the venture capital firms here. I totted up the amount of money, and the amount of cash, venture capital cash, that went to companies with 1 female founder, not a female chief executive, just 1 female founder, was 3%. That was 3% of the amount of money. The average amount of money that went to a startup looking for venture capital money was €600,000. The average for a male only was 6 million. So there are massive structural issues, certainly in the tech industry, quite apart from.
And if you look at tech, what you find is that the decisions made by venture capitalists reflect the ownership and the partners in venture capital companies.
Oh yeah, sure. Half of them went to the same school.
Again, it is back to needing to change the fundamentals. So what do we do about that? And actually, I mean, the encouraging thing is we now have these conversations. I mean, when we used to have these conversations 15 years ago, people just thought you were some sort of a crackpot sitting harping
PC nonsense,
on, and whereas today I actually think it's great, and it's driven, and the conversations that we're having now in Enterprise Ireland are sort of funny because it's the men who are leading the pack in terms of what we should be doing, and I'm saying no, women don't want that, forgot about that. Like, so it isn't. These decisions are difficult. And just reading, in today's Irish Times, when they were talking about the decision that Mary Mitchell O'Connor made about having female professorships, and there's a lot of females are negative on the positive discrimination pieces, and you can argue both sides of the thing. So they're not easy solutions to come up with, but I still think we need to have those conversations.
There are some outliers we should also point out. So it's always good to point out people who are making it. So you take someone like Dr. Nora Caldy, Neuritas, 40 million euro in venture capital funding, world-beating biotech solution. She's conscious that she essentially now is a role model, but it's really good to look to these.
And she was the largest fundraiser for that class of, that she came through in AI. Each year we take all of the startups, and it's a class of 2017, 18, 19, whatever it might be. So the largest fundraiser for any of our startups was a female-led startup. So it is possible, and really Nora has a critical role in terms of encouraging others that it can be done.
Yeah. Any other questions from the floor? There's the lady here at the end.
Great, thanks Adrian. Gina Quinn, President here at NCI. I'd like to come back to Julie's theme about innovation, because we have a lot of students here who do fantastic projects for their final year, their capstone project for their undergraduate degree, or indeed for a master's degree. And I'm just wondering, what's the magic formula that we should be giving those students to ensure that they take seriously the opportunity of commercialising that project? How do you get from a great idea to actually getting it into a business proposition? You and your team must be doing that all the time.
Yeah. So what I would say, Gina, is that getting introduced, and we have a team in Enterprise Ireland who are working only on commercialisation funding, and that is providing funding to people within the third level system to help them to spin out their whatever those projects might be. And they're also one of the funds that we have supported, for example, the University Fund, and that is going in and trying to put seed funding into those projects as well. So the first thing I would be saying is we should get somebody from the commercialisation fund down to NCI to talk to the students about the supports that are available. And there is significant funding, and there is stronger funding available when you're within that university and third level system to be able to encourage, and the deeper the work done at that stage, the better results longer term. So the first step, I would say, is to meet people from the commercialisation side who have really strong experience and can provide one-to-one work with people who have projects. That's what they're trying to do. Each year, about 15% of our high potential startups come out of the third level. I actually think that's not enough. There must be loads of them that we're losing. One of the things that we did is we have a business partners program where we bring in experienced serial entrepreneurs who have done it, have sold out, and they will come in and they've gone into universities and colleges. They've looked at technology, things that have been developed, projects that are there that nothing has happened with, and then with a view to trying to put a team around it in order to be able to spin them out. So it's something that we are really very, very interested in. Typically all startups are not equal, and the ones that come out of the third level, on average, are higher growth projects than the average. So it's something that we are really keen to involve with. And it's an area where we typically are seeing more female entrepreneurs and really strong projects.
Listen, thank you very much for being here today. My sincere thanks to Julie Sinnamon, the Chief Executive of Enterprise Ireland, and to Terence O'Rourke, the Chairman of Enterprise Ireland. And that's all we have time for today on today's Partners in Business discussion. So my thanks to the National College of Ireland and to I&M for making this series possible. And we will see you at the next one. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.